The Spitfire Kids from the Toll House in Lancaster. The Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain was fought and won by teenagers. The average age of a fighter was just 20 years old. Many of the men and women who designed and built their planes were even younger. The Spitfire Kids tells the story of these heroes using diaries and memoirs. It tells the story of Britain's most iconic fighter aircraft through the voices of the young Britons who risked everything to design, build and fly her. It isn't a story of stiff upper lips, stoical moustaches and aerial heroics. It's a story of love and loss, a story of young people tested to the very limits of their endurance. They were vital in keeping the Royal Air Force fully operational, building parts, constructing radar systems, coordinating supplies, ferrying planes, whilst the Luftwaffe above tried to bomb them into destruction. These were young people who won a battle that turned a war. Through fresh interviews, war diaries and personal correspondence, this story recounts an incredible tale of courage and sacrifice that celebrates Britain's greatest generation. The photo shows Prime Minister Winston Churchill discussing riveting techniques at the Castle Bromwich Spitfire factory. Spitfire, the people's plane. Over 80 years on, the myth of the stiff upper lip has intensified into accepted fact. Our collective memory of the Battle of Britain is permanently fixed, populated by a cast of handsome upper-class pilots and plucky workers, always ready for a chorus of "Roll Out the Barrel." It doesn't leave much room for emotion, for love and hate, boredom or fear. It means we miss the crucial fact that so many of these home front heroes were in their teens and early 20s, whether they were panel beaters, draftswomen or fighter pilots. Many were teenagers, enjoying their first pay packets. They had barely tested adult life when they huddled in the cockpits, weighing up their chances in the face of death. Like most teenagers, they felt every emotion keenly. The highs were higher and the lows lower. Imagine the ground tremble and kick as bombs drop around you. Feel the adrenaline surge as your plane twists and turns to escape the tracer-spitting Messerschmitt on your tail. Add to the confusion of hormones and the tangled emotions of any teenager, and you have an intensity of experience that's almost too much to process. Read their diaries or listen to interviews with those who played a part in the Spitfire story, and you'll certainly find plenty of stiff upper lips. But listen again, read a little deeper, and the teenagers beneath reveal themselves, frightened, confused, and astonishingly brave. In 2008, the Spitfire pilot Geoffrey Whelan took a walk around the Lizard Peninsula in Cornwall. He realised something important during the Battle of Britain. Flying as a teenage pilot in a Spitfire squadron in 1940 was the pinnacle of his life. He said, "Nobody wants a thank you, nobody wants a medal. What we want is to be remembered, because those who were shot down didn't get a medal and deserved it. We're not heroes, don't give us medals, just remember us, that's all. They deserve to be remembered." The perfect target. It's too loud to chat. The typewriters, dozens of them, rattle and ping. The bass rumble of machinery 4 floors below, flattened every few minutes by the heart-stopping thud of a drop hammer or the shrill shriek of a band solo. metal against metal. The factory is running day and night, 7 days a week. Shifts have been increased to 70 hours a week. Every worker is close to breaking point. The command from the ministry is clear. More Spitfires, more Spitfires. Britain stands alone against the Nazis. Hitler's forces have swept west through Holland, Belgium and France. Their guns are close enough to shell the English coast. Invasion is imminent, but before the German army can cross the channel, they need to wipe out the Royal Air Force. They've been doing a pretty good job of that, destroying airfields and aircraft on the ground and in the air. By August, there's virtually nothing in reserve. The RAF squadrons desperately need new aircraft, particularly the Spitfire, the fastest and deadliest fighter plane of the war. The supermarine factory is vulnerable. Southampton is a compact industrial city, turning out vital material for the war effort. There's the Thornycroft shipyard building, corvettes and destroyers for the Navy, and the Pirelli factory, making cables, pipes and machine parts for all sorts of planes, boats and munitions. Air raid sirens sound every day. Workers scurry for shelter and production stops. The government's war cabinet is worried, so they send a message. Because so much time is being lost at work, you will only get a warning when danger is imminent. A delayed warning system will be introduced. Public air raid alarms will be ignored and work sirens sounded only when spotters on the roof see enemy aircraft approaching. More bombs. The management at Supermarine and the government aren't blind to the vulnerability of the Spitfire factory at Castle Bromwich, 130 miles to the north. A massive new factory is being built to make use of the engineering skills of the area's car makers, but the team in the Midlands is far from ready. On Tuesday, September 24th, in the afternoon, there was a terrific gunfire and the whine of bombs. There was no warning, just a terrible roaring as the noise of the anti-aircraft guns and the bombs merged into one horrific wall of sound. But the factories got off lightly. The bombs missed their target. But across town, 42 people are dead and 63 seriously injured. By Thursday, September 26, 2 days after the raid that killed Peggy Moo, one of the girls who worked in the factory but was at home, Spitfire production is up and running again. There are empty spaces at typewriters and workbenches. Conversation turns to the day ahead, not the dead crushed in their shelters. Spitfire parts are being dipped, doped, bent, rolled and assembled on the factory floor, and Peggy's friend Joan is busy in the office. Arthur Thompson, an electrician at Supermarine, is on his day off when the sky fills with German aircraft. He recalls, "I saw about 100 bombers with a fighter escort. Apparently they started over Bournemouth, but I watched the aircraft over the factory, drop their bombs and away over Portsmouth and back home." 70 tons of bombs dropped from the Hankels. 7 bombs hit the Woolston works and 1 rips open the Itchin factory. Air raid shelters take a pounding. Phone call in Whitehall. The Ministry of Aircraft Production, Lord Beaverbrook, takes a call in Whitehall, steps into his chauffeur-driven car and speeds straight down to Southampton. He knows Britain's air defences are at breaking point and needs to survey the damage for himself. Beaverbrook is a newspaper baron, a tightly wound ball of ego and energy. He's turned the failing Durley Express into the country's best-selling newspaper. The loss of the Woolston and Itchin works is an enormous blow. Supermarine's quiet, analytical General Manager Harry Pratt has been badly injured in the bombing, so Beaverbrook is met at the factory by a frustrated and angry young firebrand, works engineer Len Gooch. Beaverbrook thumped the table. "Look, I want more Spitfires, more Spitfires." Len and his team are battered, bruised and tetchy, but they do have something to offer Beaverbrook. The factory is a clear and obvious target, so why not move the machinery out to places the Germans can't spot? The idea catches Beaverbrook's imagination, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. He barks at Gooch. "You're going to disperse all over the country, complete dispersal." Production of the Spitfire must restart immediately, but not in a city centre factory. It will be dispersed, hidden amongst towns and villages, hidden among the very people the Spitfire is supposed to protect. It will be a change that breaks every rule of modern industry and places thousands of new workers right in the heart of the battle. No one knows how it will work, but the promise is made. The Phoenix. On the BBC Home Service, Beaverbrook makes a solemn speech to the nation. "We must recognise that the enemy is making preparations for the invasion of Britain. Invasion by land and sea, but principally by the air. How are we going to meet and overcome this danger? By industry, by enterprise, by endurance, and by fortitude. Here let me say that all those engaged in the production of aircraft have demonstrated a vast measure of industry and endurance. We have the inspiring knowledge that the aircraft we make will be directed by firm and strong hands. It is our task to assure the pilots that the supply is adequate to necessity and worthy of the men who fly for Britain over the land and over the sea." An odd sense of relief shuddered through the workforce. The death and destruction was deeply traumatic, but the tension had been released. For Cyril Russell and his friends, the months of waiting for the inevitable, months of fearing the worst, were over. I went back into the works to collect my tools, and saw for myself that men were busily uprooting the vital jigs while the almost undamaged machine shop was actually working under a missing roof. Cyril said, "On the following Monday I was informed by the Labour Exchange to report to Hendy's garage just off Southampton High Street, and upon arrival there were fuselage jigs that had been uprooted from Woolston and reset in what had been, on the previous Thursday, one of Southampton's largest garage and car showrooms. So in 5 days after what had looked like a disaster, I was back building Spitfire fuselages, and I was by no means the only one, or this the only working unit." More sites found. 3 garages have been scouted out before the bombing, and some machinery and parts transferred in expectation of the destruction. There were Hendy's garage in Pond Tree Lane and Seward's garage in Winchester Road, were big 2-storey buildings with concrete floors connected by a ramp. They would be ideal for fuselage production. Lowther's garage in Shirley would be a 2-room for the jig borer machines. It was a start, but nowhere near enough to replace the 2 abandoned factories in the city's industrial heart. How could production be dispersed? Those decisions were being made on the upper floor of Southampton's top hotel, the Polygon, which had been taken over by the supermarine management and the men from the ministry. There was Wilf Elliott, the works superintendent, Wing Commander Keller from the Air Ministry, and the works engineer, the tetchy Len Gooch, joined by 2 of Beaverbrook's men, a pair called Whitehead and Cowley. These were the officials making the decisions, Dennis Webb, a charming but impatient spare parts manager who had to kick-start the dispersal. He drove the streets of Southampton, bullying and cajoling owners out of their premises, but his boss's eyes were trained on a map pinned to a bedroom wall in the Polygon Hotel. It showed roads spreading inland like the fingers of a hand from Southampton out to a 60-mile radius. What is truly remarkable is that each morning, even at the height of the Southampton Blitz, so many workers did return from the trek out to the countryside for safety. To Lord Beaverbrook, however, it had become obvious that Southampton was simply too vulnerable to be relied upon. Spitfire production had to be dispersed far from the dangers of the city. Dispersal works. The return of the German bombers over Southampton in the November Blitz emphasised, if any reminder were needed, that the dispersal had to be accelerated. A series of enormous raids between November 22nd and December 1st devastated the city. Only one of the dispersed production sites was shut down by the bombing, but the Blitz had a significant impact on production. With a renewed sense of urgency, Dennis Webb began to radiate out from the city on the hunt for suitable buildings. He was urged to take note of dimensions and type of construction, as well as services such as electricity and water. All the information was collated. Then Len Gooch made the decisions which building to seize. The owners were telephoned and told their building was being requisitioned. If any protest was made, the big guns were brought to bear in the shape of Cowley or Whitehead, known to the rest of the team as Beaverbrook's Bully Boys. Dennis Webb worked closely with them, relishing the mixture of fear and fury they provoked in the stubborn owners of workshops and showrooms. Businesses weren't always keen to give up their premises. One warehouse in Winchester had been requisitioned by the Ministry of Food, but Cowley had other plans. What have you got stored here? Went the slow Canadian drawl. Silence, then pineapples. Jesus, do you think we can win this goddamn war with pineapples? The result was inevitable. We got the premises the next day. Cowley would cheerfully have requisitioned any building the ministry wanted, or even one they didn't want. Life changes. By mid-November 1940, a total of around 35 workshops were up and running. As the dispersal spread and distances grew, 5 distinct production centres emerged from the initial chaos, with the largest one, Southampton, at the base of the fan. 25 miles to the northwest, there was a production hub in the cathedral city of Salisbury. A purpose-built factory was thrown up 40 miles to the northeast as part of the Newbury hub. In nearby Reading, Vincent's garage turned out fuselages, while the Caversham factory across the River Thames installed the Rolls-Royce engines. 50 miles northwest of the city, Trowbridge became the final production centre, and it was there to 4 Street Garage that Cyril Russell was transferred again. He had been promoted several times since the war had started. He created order from chaos. Not bad for a lad who'd left school at 14. By 1942, there would be almost 250 subcontractors, supplying over 50 workshops and stores all across the English counties of Hampshire, Wiltshire and Berkshire. Lodging could usually be found. Billeting officers would scout out spare rooms and force homeowners to rent them to essential workers. Ezzie Dean was delighted the day she finished her education at tiny Keble School in Hursley. A junior clerical position was arranged. Essie was issued with a military pass and told to clock in at Hursley's House Grand Entrance Hall. Now the oak-lined corridors were busy with draftsmen and engineers developing new marks of the Spitfire. Her first job was entering information into a ledger, but fortunately a kindly secretary taught Essie to type, and she quickly moved on to more interesting work. Every part of the Spitfire had a code, and the right code had to be sent to the right workshop, and this became Essie's job, one she turned out to be very good at. Once her typing skills improved, she quickly moved on to typing the specification sheet masters of designs of individual aircraft. She was paid 19 shillings a week, 10 of which she passed to her mother. That left plenty of spare cash for camp dances and for the bus fare to the cinema in Winchester. The quiet country life was over for Essie, and so many young men and women like her. Like it or not, their world had opened up. Heroines of the home front. The RAF's most precious resource, the lives of its fighter pilots, was in the hands of women like Dorothy Handel. You can see Dorothy in the photograph, who had travelled to England from Melbourne, Australia in 1927 at the age of 14. By 1939, she was an aircraft woman second class. This photo from inside a Spitfire factory dubbed Dorothy and her colleagues heroines of the home front. By late 1943, some 500 women were working for the Aeronautical Inspection Directorate around Southampton and Portsmouth. Despite the immense efforts expended in relocating the Spitfire works out of the German line of fire, Britain was engaged in total war. By 1942, Cyril Russell had moved to a tiny hangar at High Post Flying Club. It used to take 2.5 days of day and night shifts to make a single Spitfire. The overall effect used to be 6 aircraft per week produced, hardly enough to turn back the Luftwaffe. But Cyril's 6 Spitfires a week were joined by 750 from Reading and Newbury, 2,300 from Salisbury, 600 from Trowbridge, and over 4,000 from the factories of Southampton. Production from the dispersed factories would eventually be overhauled by the Castle Bromwich production line, which turned out a total of 12,000 Spitfires by the end of the war. In sheer numbers, those were vital aircraft, but Castle Bromwich lacked flexibility. The dispersed workshops were able to adapt much quicker than the modern production lines of Birmingham. Ministry of Aircraft Production. Take a step back. On May 10, 1940, German forces invaded Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. The phony war was over. Calls for a national government grew louder. The Labour Party refused to support the incumbent Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. The only plausible candidates were Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax and First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, and by the evening King George VI had appointed Churchill as the United Kingdom's new leader. A new government department was created, the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and the new minister was appointed to lead it, Max Aitken, Lord Beaverbrook. The Canadian press baron was hated by the left and distrusted by many on the right, but on taking office, Beaverbrook knew production of Spitfires were the urgent priority. The answer lay with the British public, but the path to their wallets took a circuitous route around the empire. The initial idea was inspired by a reporter on The Gleaner, the best-selling newspaper in Jamaica, who asked, how much is a Spitfire? Figures between £5,000 and £20,000 were put forward. Soon another inquiry came from Sir Harry Oakes, an American gold miner, who moved to the British Bahamas to evade tax. The ministry plucked a figure from the air, 5,000. Oakes, incidentally, was brutally murdered 3 years later. He was killed in his island home with a miner's pick, his body badly burned with insecticide and then covered with feathers from a mattress. The investigation into this grisly crime was led by the governor of the Bahamas, the former King Edward VIII, and given the Duke of Windsor's reputation for arrogance and incompetence, the murder inquiry was a shambles, after 2 Miami detectives hired by the Duke had fabricated evidence. The murder of Harry Oakes remains unsolved to this day. A notional price list was drawn up and the public invited to contribute. A Spitfire, ready to fly, was £5,000. The Merlin engine alone cost £2,000. A spark plug was 8 shillings and a petrol tank was £40. 1 rivet cost 6pence and 60 screws cost 5 shillings. Young Peter Bottomley knocked on doors and collected around Guildford. When he sent in his contribution, he got a thank you letter from Buckingham Palace that told him he'd raised enough money for a rear wheel of a Spitfire. The story of the Spitfire added glamour to the Spitfire's reputation and pulled cash in from across the globe. Campaigns in Britain's colonies raised enough to have the whole squadrons named after them. There was number 74, Trinidad, number 167, Gold Coast, number 114, Hong Kong. From India, the Nizam of Hyderabad paid for 2 Spitfire squadrons. Paying for Spitfires. So, did the Spitfire Fund keep the Nazis from the door and our pilots in the sky? Absolutely not. The fundamental purpose of the Spitfire Fund was to rally the nation, to unite the people in the fight against Hitler. It would have been no surprise if those at the sharp end of the home front, in the flames of London's East End or Clydebank's shattered docks, had begun to question why this war was being fought and why it was only them that appeared to be expendable. The Spitfire was a stunning representation of Britain united. It provided living, flying proof that British workmanship could prevail against the Nazis, proof that the daily sacrifice being asked of Britons would one day prove worthwhile. The Spitfire was a bulwark against defeatism, and the Spitfire Fund helped enrol the whole nation in that fight. What else could unite cocktail-sipping sophisticates in Buenos Aires with Scottish fishermen and home counties schoolgirls? What else but the Spitfire? The story of the dispersal and the secret Spitfire factories emerged long after the war was over, but it dovetailed neatly with the Spitfire legend that had already become a pillar of British identity. Supermarine's design department suffered a direct hit in the September 1940 bombings of the Southampton factory. Unexploded bombs ripped through the floor of the office block. They were moved out to the local university college, but within weeks the Luftwaffe had launched its bombing blitz on Southampton. Hundreds of civilians died as the city burned. Hundreds of engineers, draftsmen and women, craftsmen and designers moved 10 miles north to a very different world. The inspiration of Hursley. Hursley House is an elegant Queen Anne mansion set in hundreds of acres of rolling countryside, with stunning views all the way to the English Channel and the Isle of Wight. By 1940, it was the home of an American railway heiress, the widowed and extremely wealthy Lady Mary Cooper, who offered her home as a hospital. Hursley was far enough from Southampton to escape the bombs. The first supermarine staff arrived on December 7th, 1940. December 1942, a notice appeared in the Times. The Dowager Lady Cooper has left Hursley Park, Winchester, and is now residing in Romsey. At last, the Spitfire designers had the place to themselves, but through the gates of Hursley Park cycled a determined 18-year-old art student from Portsmouth by the name of Stella Brough. She said we had to clock in and out every day, and I'd sit at my desk while my colleagues, 3 draftsmen who prepared initial drawings of the Spitfire before passing them to me, and I made the master linen copies for printing before they were put into crates to be sent to Lieutenant General Montgomery in North Africa. Stella Broughton was a perfectionist, like the late father of the Spitfire, the spirit of Reginald Joseph Mitchell, the engineer from Stoke-on-Trent, drove the team at Hursley Park. It was his inspirational leadership that bonded the team, now stretching every sinew to make the Spitfire ever faster. If they failed, Britain could lose her mastery of the skies. To understand why the construction and development of the Spitfire became so important to the defence of Britain, it was a time when speed was an international obsession and an intense young English engineer stood on the brink of greatness. Data and danger. In late 1935, Mitchell's Type 300, the Spitfire prototype, was taking shape in sheds at Woolston. The day would come when it would take to the skies for the first time. It was work that required a pilot with an exceptional range of skills, as the job of a test pilot in the 30s and 40s was vitally important and incredibly dangerous. Few possessed the combination of qualities of Geoffrey Quill. With no flight simulators or computers to crunch the data, the first moment a designer could be sure that their new plane would fly at all was when a test pilot fired up the engine and took it for a spin. But as well as being a fine aviator, the test pilot had to be a meticulous data gatherer. Geoffrey Quill would have a clipboard tied to his thigh with a built-in stopwatch. While concentrating on the control of an unfamiliar aircraft, he would transcribe numbers from the dials around him, all the while using his flying experience to form an instinctive judgment on the flight handling characteristics that instruments couldn't measure. Nobody knew the Spitfire like Geoffrey Quill. He joined the RAF at the age of 18 and accepted a short service commission. He was swiftly spotted as an exceptional flyer and was fast-tracked into 17 Squadron, a crack fighter unit flying the latest Bristol Bulldogs. Quill's next move. As the autumn of 1935 turned to winter, Vickers Aviation Chief Test Pilot Joseph Summers was struggling with his workload. Hitler's aggressive intentions were now apparent to Britain's national government, who had released funds for air defence, and there was a rush of orders from Vickers and its supermarine subsidiary. Help was needed, and Geoffrey Quill fitted the bill perfectly, and he joined Vickers Aviation in January 1936. Quill, who was a charming and sharp-witted, soon cemented his own position. Following Summers' first flight in the Spitfire, Geoffrey Quill took his Spitfire flight on March 26, 1936, and Mitchell, the designer, must have felt more anxious than Quill. Regular bouts of pain racked his body. He knew that his cancer had returned, and his prospects for recovery this time were very slim indeed. Geoffrey said, I used to look down when I was flying, and I would see Mitchell's yellow Rolls Royce parked on the tarmac. When I landed, I would sit in his car and talk to him. Two very different men, one young and eager to express his opinions, the other urgent and anxious to pass on his knowledge. The Spitfire would continue to benefit from their short, intense relationship long after Mitchell had died. The plane was very fast, but certainly manageable. That was good enough for the increasingly desperate British government. On June 3, 1936, a contract was issued for the construction of 310 Spitfires. The death of Mitchell. 2 long and frustrating years of intense tooling, testing and tweaking followed. For months, Mitchell did his best, but eventually he retreated to his bed and wrote a heart-rending sequence of letters to his 17-year-old son, Gordon. A final desperate trip to a cancer specialist in Vienna did nothing to reverse his condition. After 5 weeks of intensive treatment, he returned on a private plane to Eastleigh Aerodrome, where the Spitfire prototype was based. Sadly, he died at noon on June 11, 1937. In the Battle of Britain, Messerschmitt 109s would fly on 87-octane fuel. Britain's 100-octane fuel gave the Merlin III engines a 30% power increase from 1,000 to 1,310 horsepower. It provided the Spitfires of the Battle of Britain with a small but significant power advantage. As Hitler's blitzkrieg crushed Poland, Quill became convinced that he should do his bit on the front line, so he went straight to the top and called Keith Park, head of Fighter Command's 11th Group, and on August 5th, Quill squeezed back into his RAF uniform and reported for duty to 65 Squadron at Hornchurch in Essex. On August 24, 1940, with less than a month of action, Geoffrey Quill returned to Supermarine. The Mark III was ready for testing. Quill was deeply frustrated by the order. The Mark I Spitfire had clung on to a few features of heritage aviation. The ailerons and rudder were still constructed in a traditional way, but the switch to metal ailerons made an immediate and dramatic difference. The Spitfire was now a dream to manoeuvre at high speed. Step forward, Miss Shilling. Rolls-Royce already had a better engine ready to fly. The Merlin 20 was fitted with a 2-speed gearbox in its supercharger, which significantly increased its performance at high altitude. Unfortunately, the 20 was noticeably longer than the Merlin 3. A shirt-turn bodge job was contrived, with Rolls-Royce producing the Merlin 45 engine. This mongrel aircraft was labelled as the Mark V. It put the Spitfire back on par with the latest variant of the Messerschmitt 109, but the high-speed arms race was getting faster and tougher for Britain. Despite the obvious clues, they failed to realise that the Germans were injecting nitrous oxide or laughing gas into the 109's supercharger. British engineers wasted many man-hours trying to recreate the effect in their own fighters with a much more dangerous oxygen boost. Fortunately, one engineer was more perceptive and more focused. She knew what really mattered, a solution to the Spitfire's most persistent niggle. In 1940, the Spitfire problem landed on the desk of the head of the carburetor section at RAE. That job was occupied by a fairly extraordinary person, standing 5 foot 1 inch tall with thick glasses and a stern expression. The extraordinary thing, even in wartime, was she was a woman always addressed by her staff as Miss Shilling. Beatrice Shilling was the daughter of a butcher from Kingston upon Thames. From a very young age, it was clear that B, as the family called her, was different from other middle-class Edwardian girls. As a child, she played with Meccano, spent pocket money on penknives, a glue pot, an adjustable spanner. She built wireless receiving sets. she could dismantle her two-stroke motorcycle and assemble it again easily. Brooklands, home of motorcycle racing. As soon as women were permitted to race at Brooklands, B bought a demonstration model 500cc International Norton. Brooklands offered generous cash prizes for race winners, but the Gold Star was truly coveted, awarded to anyone who could reach the then incredible speed of 100 miles an hour. In 1934, on a hot, sticky August race day, B was competing for just the second time at Brooklands, and the motorcycling magazine reported, after a slowish first lap, Miss B Schilling made up for lost time with a second circuit of 101 miles an hour, thus joining the select ranks of Gold Star holders, being the second woman to do so. Between races, B was job hunting. In 1936, she secured a position at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the RAA, after many unsuccessful applications to other companies who were very anti-women, but at the RAA it was the start of a distinguished 35-year career at the heart of Britain's world-leading aeronautics industry. B achieved a remarkable feat in resolving many problems in the design of the Spitfire, but as the war progressed and the slim Spitfire chassis was loaded with more powerful engines and heavier weaponry, aircraft began to fall from the skies. Solving this mystery would require an investigator with deep Spitfire knowledge. They called in Geoffrey Quill, who helped test the use of weights to balance the aircraft, but he raised a problem with friends at the Westland Aircraft Company in Yeovil. They already had lots of experience with a naval variant of the Spitfire, the Seafire. They added a bulge to the elevator, the horizontal flaps at the rear of the Spitfire. Once installed, the mid-air breakup stopped and the pilots could focus once more on the Luftwaffe without the worry of a mysterious flaw in their aircraft. Miss Schilling's orifice. The source of the problem, it seemed, was the AVT-40 carburettor fitted to the Merlin engines used in Spitfires and Hurricanes. B set up a test bed with rigs and a hydraulic fuel pump, so B conducted in-flight tests on a Merlin engine, tinkering with fuel pressure settings and the steepness of dives for 19 hours a day. Her team tested, prodded and poked at possible solutions. In the early spring of 1941, B finally had her answer. It was astonishingly simple, but the engineering know-how behind it was tremendous. It was just a tiny washer, a metal ring no bigger than a fingernail, with a carefully chamfered inner edge, fitted between the end of the fuel intake pipe and the entrance to the carburettor fuel inlet gallery. It allowed enough petrol through for maximum power, but not enough to flood the engine. The solution, the brass restrictor, was unveiled at the Derby Works of Rolls-Royce in February 1941. It was cured in a very simple way by a famous lady engineer from the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Miss Schilling, and she put a small thing about the size of a penny with a hole in it, and it was called Miss Schilling's orifice, although never to her face. The washer is more properly called the RAE restrictor. Crucially, the orifice would be fitted without removing the engine or even the carburettor from the plane. There was certainly no time to be lost. The washer had to be fitted into every Spitfire in the country. B wasn't about to trust something so important to anyone else. She delivered the restrictors herself in her usual style at enormous speed on her trusty Norton 490cc. With a bag of tools on her back, she distributed her sack full of orifices to the mechanics at RAF bases around the country. The legacy of Beatrice Shilling. After the war, Bee often ruffled the feathers of the RAE management with her blunt approach, but she continued to work on some of the British government's top aviation priorities: guided missiles, observation aircraft, and the Blue Streak, Britain's attempt to build its own ballistic missiles. By the time of her retirement in 1969, she was aware of the doors she and other wartime women had opened, but she was also aware just how much there was still to do. Bee believed in 100% equality. She didn't think gender mattered. When it came to her work, it is fantastic that she's been rediscovered, and there is now a scholarship to Manchester University in her name. He died that England might live, and England lives because he died. Reginald Mitchell, inventor of the Spitfire, Englishman, visionary and patriot, whose genius rides the skies of England, and whose winged avengers tore down the goring gangsters from the blue and sent them crashing to the earth at Mother England, which he loved. The romantic image of the Spitfire is now set in stone, as its reputation as the best fighter aircraft of the war. Flying the latest Mark V Spitfires, pilots felt confident, even against the upgraded Messerschmitt 109s, but that confidence dissolved in the autumn of 1941, when a captured German serviceman revealed the basics of a new aircraft. But by August 13th, the Air Ministry reported a fighter with a two-bank radial engine and the top speed at 370 to 390 mile an hour. The Focke-Wulf 190A1 was ready to savage the Royal Air Force. Early encounters proved without doubt that the Spitfire Mark V was outclassed by the Focke-Wulf 190, and Fighter Command was forced to rein back its offensive operations in France, Belgium and Holland. A deadly new foe. Number 12 Commando Unit was stationed close to Geoffrey Quill's home in Burlesdon, Hampshire. One day in 1942, the head of the Commando's E Troop, Captain Philip Pinkney, dropped in uninvited for tea. Quill instantly recognised him, a man of rare and timeless character. In short, Pinkney was the type of chap who built the British Empire, a man, as Quill put it, who was very unlikely to survive the war. Pinkney had a plan, but for it to succeed, he absolutely needed Quill's special skills, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. Within days, he had Quill in training, paddling an inflatable boat on Southampton water. The plan was to steal a Focke-Wulf. A naval gunboat would ferry Pinkney and Quill under cover of darkness to the French coast. They would row the final few hundred yards in an inflatable boat, bury it and proceed inland. Quill takes up the story. We were going to be put ashore and get into a German airfield, probably Abbeville. I made the stipulation that the army would get me into the cockpit of the 190 with the engine running, and from then on it was up to me. I thought if we got that far, I had a little better than a 50-50 chance of getting off the airfield and getting back. It would be fascinating to see just how much better this new German wonder plane was. The gung-ho commander was supremely confident that he could get Quill to the plane, but hadn't a clue how he would get home. Whatever the gaping holes in the plan, HQ Combined Operations gave their stamp of approval, and the top secret designation, Operation Air Thief. All Quill could do now was wait for the starting pistol, nervously. The whole plan was cancelled when a Focke-Wulf 190 was landed intact in Wales. The German pilot didn't know the Bristol Channel from the English Channel. Luftwaffe pilot Oberlieutenant Armin Faber was part of a squadron of Focke-Wulfs that had pursued a raiding party of British Boston bombers back across the Channel. In a series of dogfights with the escorting Spitfires, Faber became disorientated and mistook the Bristol Channel for the English Channel. He reportedly gave a victory roll as he landed at what he assumed was a French airfield. It was in fact RAF Pembroke, a small airbase in southwest Wales. The sergeant on guard duty leapt on Faber's wing, pointed a flare gun at him and hollered, "Hand hock," before he had the chance to destroy the aircraft. Within 5 days, Faber's Focke-Wulf 190A3 was being studied by the Rolls-Royce engineers, and Operation Air Thief was called off. Philip Pinckney survived his buccaneering lifestyle for another year before being killed in northern Italy, leading a group of 6 SAS parachutists far behind enemy lines. On June 28, 1942, Ernest Hives, head of aero engines at Rolls-Royce, wrote to Sir Wilfrid Freeman, Vice Chief of Air Staff, "We feel very depressed about the fighter position, and this has not improved since one of our own pilots examined the FW-190, so they decided to fly 3 planes against each other." Hawker test pilot Seth Smith was to fly the Typhoon. Willie Wilson would fly the FW-190 and Quill the Spitfire. The 3 rival aircraft took off from Farnborough, flew 10 miles west to Odiham, and on Wilson's signal, all 3 opened their throttles and sped back towards Farnborough. Halfway along the low-altitude course, the Focke-Wulf developed engine problems. Quill shot ahead of the smoking German and beat the Typhoon to the line. Proof had been provided that an all-new fighter wasn't needed, just a better Spitfire. Hawker test pilot Seth Smith was killed just a few weeks later over Surrey when the tail of his Typhoon detached in flight. Geoffrey Quill, we owe so much. Geoffrey Quill also went on to test the post-war generation of jet fighters, but many years of flying unpressurised aircraft at extraordinary altitudes and speeds had affected his health. In June 1947, he was flying the prototype of the new Attacker jet at a height of 40,000 feet when he passed out, returning to consciousness 30,000 feet down to land safely, but his days as a test pilot were over. In a 50-year career, Geoffrey Quill flew more than 90 different types of aircraft and had a key role in the design of military planes right into the 1970s. Without his remarkable ability to establish a rapport with the designers and engineers on the ground, the Spitfire could not have been incrementally improved right through the course of the Second World War. In his race with the Focke-Wulf, Geoffrey Quill had proved a point that the Supermarine team had been pressing for a long time. As early as 1940, Joe Smith, the man who took over Mitchell's role as chief designer, had become convinced that the Spitfire was capable of infinite revision and development. Joe Smith learned his engineering skills at Austin Motors in Longbridge, Birmingham, before moving south in 1921 to join Supermarine. One of his first decisions at Herzl was to form a dedicated team capable of creating machine tooling and prototype aircraft close to the designers. Once fully installed at Hursley Park, the Supermarine Design Office became a technology hub. It transformed employees from workers into team members, and this close-knit team accelerated the development of the Spitfire again and again to combat the best efforts of the German engineers. Many countries supplied brave pilots. Many versions of the Spitfire were born at Earsley House. Interceptors, ground attack, reconnaissance planes, the Seafire that could take off from aircraft carriers, the Mark 9 that could match and beat the best of the Germans had. As D-Day came and the Allied forces pushed through France, the Spitfire would be the master of the skies, destroying German fighters, strafing tanks and supporting the bombers, ripping the heart out of their Nazi war effort. The Spitfire would be the only fighter built at the start of the war that was still being produced and sent into frontline action as the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It outlived all of its competitors, thanks to the likes of Stella Broughton and the designers, engineers and draftsmen and women of Earsley Park. The people of a shattered company and a shattered city had found a way to rebuild Spitfires against the odds. At each stage of the conflict, the builders and designers provided the right tools for the job, but those planes had to be flown and battles won against the most powerful air force that the world had ever seen. Brave young British pilots were joined by the defeated ranks of Poles and Czechs, French and Belgians. American flyers defied their government to cross the Atlantic in search of adventure, and Canada, New Zealand and the Caribbean supplied the Royal Air Force with many more. Each pilot would form a bond with their Spitfire as they learned its tricks, forgave its flaws and flew higher and faster than any of them had ever dreamt of. The Flyers. Few of those veterans have talked as vividly about the transcendent highs of flying a Spitfire, or written as honestly about the deep, dark lows of fighting and killing day after day. As Geoffrey Wellen said, you had to realise very early on in the Battle of Britain, if you stayed still, if you flew straight and level for 20 seconds, you were dead. Never stay still. If you can't see anything, it was always the chap you couldn't see who shot you down. Just 17 when he joined the Royal Air Force, Geoffrey Wellen was the youngest Battle of Britain Spitfire pilot to survive the war. He credited his survival to luck and to that 20-second rule, but this level of tension, this hyper-alert state, demands a toll. I realised at the time, and I can confirm it now, that I'd reached the pinnacle of my life, and nothing would replace being in a fighter squadron for 1940, 1941 and 1942, and it never did. Geoffrey Wellen was brought up in Essex, where his father was a member of a local flying club. Young Jeff was instantly attracted to the colourful biplanes. He decided there and then that he wanted to fly. In early 1939, he was a boarder at Forest School in North East London. He was captain of the first 11 cricket team, but Jeff was desperate to take to the air. It was August 1939 when Jeff was accepted for training with the RAF, flying his first solo flight in a Tiger Moth biplane 2 days before Britain declared war with Germany. Training was fast and ruthless. Navigation, instrument flying, aerobatics, too much to take in. Jeff and his fellow trainees were pushed to the limit. His first close RAF friend died when his aircraft stalled and fell to the ground. Others were sent home as they failed their flying tests or found themselves labelled as temperamentally unsuitable for combat. Geoffrey Wellen was assigned to a Spitfire squadron. In June 1940, with no combat training, having never flown a fighter aircraft, Jeff was assigned to a newly formed Spitfire squadron at Duxford, near Cambridge. As his new comrades at 92 Squadron flew off to protect the British and French troops trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, Jeff got his first taste of a Spitfire. Spitfire K for King stood waiting, with its narrow legs. It seemed to Jeff like a delicate racehorse rather than a war machine. The dreamy teenager was grabbed by rough, experienced hands. The ground crew strapped me in and it was a bit intimidating. Even the startup, smoke coming back. I remember taxiing out very careful. It seemed to hurtle itself into the air, with me hanging on to the stick and the throttle, dragging me along with it. Once airborne, Jeff composed himself to gain control of the powerful machine. The exhilaration, mirrored by a strange, ethereal sense of calm, was like nothing Jeff had experienced before. There's really no other word for it. This was love, it's clean, it's pure. It gets into the very soul. You think it's absolutely beautiful. After Dunkirk, the intensity of the battle eased. Hitler paused to plot his next move, giving Jeff a chance to get to grips with his Spitfire. 30 hours of flying this beautiful machine, it's barely enough. Combat training was short, sharp and ineffective, so Jeff filled in the gaps by talking to more experienced pilots, developing his own philosophy of life and death. 15 seconds of ammunition, 8 guns, 300 rounds per gun. That's all. Jeff would have to bring down the enemy and get himself out of trouble. Every burst would have to count. A crash course in night flying. The Spitfire was never designed as a night fighter, and Jeff struggled with his spatial awareness in the crow-black dark of the rural Welsh night. Coming into land one evening, the flares marking the runway appeared to vanish. He regained some height and tried again. Once more, the flares vanished. On the third attempt, Jeff realised he was flying much closer to the ground than he thought. Fear surged, then ebbed, replaced by a brief moment of calm as he reconciled himself to death. A blinding flash of white light and the screech of tearing metal. Jeff had crashed into a landing light and written off his Spitfire. He was grounded by his furious commanding officer. With no flying and little else to do, Jeff fell into a depression. By now, the Battle of Britain was raging. Hitler was set on a summer invasion. German bombers began targeted attacks on ports, airfields and aircraft factories. 92 Squadron was transferred to Biggin Hill, Kent, right on the front line. Jeff had made mistakes, but his CO could see he was a decent pilot. He was needed for combat duty. It was the start of a fortnight of non-stop fighting that would define the rest of Jeff's life. 4 or 5 sorties every day. Engines start, Merlins, 10, 12, maybe 15 of them. The Spitfires judder and twitch. The grass flattens behind them. Plotters guide 10 Spitfires towards 100 German aircraft. Their bombers, protected by Messerschmitt Bf-109s, every bit as fast and deadly as a Spitfire. Jeff catches sight of a Heinkel 111 bomber, isolated from his formation. He gives chase and fires his 8 Browning machine guns until he's out of ammunition, and the smouldering bomber spirals towards the waves. Living with death. Every day, another comrade was gone. Butch, Bill, John, Crawford. The suppression of emotion was essential. If you lost focus, you would join the dead. We were young, you accepted it. Poor old so-and-so hasn't come back today. Never mind, we're off to the White Hart now. Fear and boredom. First one, then the other. Take off at first light, engage and kill the enemy. Back to base to refuel and rearm. Mugs of tea as you wait. exhausted to see how many of your comrades make it back alive. The stress builds and intensifies. By the end of the Battle of Britain, nearly 2,000 German aircraft had been destroyed by the RAF, but the toll had been horrendous. So many dead and so many survivors damaged for life. Jeff's headaches got worse. He had a breakdown. It was called combat fatigue, but he had been flying operations for 3 years. He had a nasty operation on a very acute sinus and then he collapsed. Back home, fishing in the ponds of Epping Forest, Jeff was relieved to be out of the cockpit, but his anxiety soon returned. He was deeply disturbed by the distress in his mother's eyes when she looked at him. He wasn't the young man who went away. Geoffrey Wellen, a hero, was broken. Something inside me gave way as I stretched out on the same familiar comfy bed and broke down. I grieved for my lost friends, and I cursed that I had reached the pinnacle of my life before the age of 22. 2 full tours on Spitfires, the Battle of Britain, and nearly 100 escorts and fighter sweeps over occupied France, and I felt destroyed by the war. Nothing in his life ever compared with that desperate, deadly summer as a teenage Spitfire pilot. This is the story of Jeff Wellen, but there were many more who paid the ultimate price. Women take the controls. In September 1945, a few days after VJ Day, a Supermarine Seafire rose past Harrods, tips its wings in salute, turns the corner at the Park Mansions and speeds west, bound for the Naval Air Base at Culross in Cornwall. At the controls is 24-year-old Monique Agazaria. It's her last day as an ATA girl. It's also a tribute to her much-loved brothers. Noel, the fighter ace, shot down over North Africa in 1941, and Jack, tortured and hanged as a spy by the Gestapo. Monique, known to her friends as Aggie, she was 19 when war broke out, so Aggie joined the Voluntary Aid Detachment, working as a nurse at the Queen Victoria Hospital, East Grinstead, where she assisted the pioneering plastic surgeon Archibald McIndoe, treating the deep burns and facial disfigurements suffered by many pilots in the Battle of Britain. In 1940, there was just one possible route to the cockpit, the Air Transport Auxiliary, the ATA. In the final months before the outbreak of war, there was a crucial gap in the supply chain. How were the new planes to reach the bases of the RAF? If they're damaged, how would they get to the workshops for repair? The obvious answer was to fly them, but all the pilots were busy fighting the war. What then? The answer was to call on civilians, men too old for the RAF, men with injuries or disabilities, and maybe, just maybe, women. There were many brave, adventurous society women with a taste for adventure, and they were unveiled to the press in January 1940, being known as the First 8. 4 of the 8 were already flying instructors. The remainder had experience of aerial displays, long-distance flying, or army cooperation. It took time for women to be accepted. Even the enemy noticed these ATA girls. The Irish Nazi propagandist Lord Ho-Ho, broadcasting from Germany, condemned them as unnatural and decadent women. At first, the British press treated them with suspicion, but editors soon learned that their readers were fascinated by stories and photographs of young women flying. While the First 8 ferried training aircraft around the UK, the Battle of Britain was raging. The lives of 544 pilots and crew from Fighter Command were lost. Another 1,000 from bomber and coastal commands also died. Pauline Gower spotted an opportunity to expand her empire of women. She wrote to ATA Commandant Gerard Delanger, imploring him to give her girls a chance. There was no reply, so she got over the obstacle by inviting Air Marshal Courtney to lunch. Impressed by her argument, he took her request straight to the top. By the middle of 1942, with 2 years of duty and an enviable safety record behind her, Pauline Gower was instructed to bring 5 of the best women to be flight tested on a Hurricane. The first of the 5 to slip into the Hurricane's cockpit was Winnie Crossley. Sure enough, Winnie took off, looped the Hurricane, landed smoothly and taxied towards her friends on the apron, where she declared, "It's lovely, darlings, a beautiful little aeroplane." From that moment on, the most experienced women of the ATA were free to fly any of the RAF fighters or twin-engine bombers. By 1943, Joan Hughes and Lettice Curtis were cleared to fly some of the biggest planes of the war, 4-engine bombers such as the Short Stirling and the Avro Lancaster. Women had to conquer prejudice. In just 6 months, Aggie flew 20 different aircraft. She relied on her Bible, a notebook with a page for each plane, giving the most basic instructions, such as takeoff speed, landing speed, and stalling speed. It took the first 8 women 2 years to be allowed into the cockpit of a Spitfire. It took Aggie a mere 60 hours of flying. At this time, Amy Johnson was being written about as being the first woman to fly solo from Britain to Australia in 1930. She was the most experienced pilot in the ATA. On January 5th, 1941, she took off from Blackpool bound for RAF Kidlington in Oxfordshire. She struggled to find a break in the cloud cover with limited instrumentation and no radio communication. She found herself circling the Thames estuary until she ran out of fuel and was forced to bail out. Her parachute opened and she landed alive in the water. Despite an attempt to rescue her, Amy Johnson's body was never recovered. A total of 173 ATA pilots died during the war, 16 of whom were women. The Air Transport Auxiliary was disbanded in November 1945, but in the 6 years of war, the ATA ferried over 300,000 aircraft. Male pilots outnumbered women 1,152 to 168, but it was the ATA girls who changed attitudes to women in aviation and the armed forces. Monique Agazarian found post-war life tougher. She applied for work with airlines large and small, but she was always turned down. Eventually, she worked for Island Air Services, and within 3 years, she was the managing director and chief pilot. Not bad for a woman dismissed by a male instructor in 1943 as not a natural pilot. Aggie died in 1993. At her wake, an old ATA colleague played a cassette labelled "Merlins for Monique" as the distinctive roar of the Spitfire engine blasted from the speakers. ATA veterans ducked for cover. The Yanks are coming. Art Donahue, who was born and raised on a dairy farm in St. Charles, Minnesota, was one of 11 Americans to fight in the Battle of Britain. One of 4 who flew a Spitfire. He wasn't the first to reach England. Already flying were Eugene Tobin and Andrew Maimdoff from California and Vernon Shorty Keogh from New York. At just 4 foot 11 inches, Keogh was the smallest pilot in the RAF, needing 2 cushions to see out of his Spitfire. The photo shows Eugene Tobin, Shorty Keogh and Andrew Maindorf. Hart said this was America's war as much as England's, and France's, because America was part of the world which Hitler and his minions were so plainly out to conquer. Just a few weeks earlier, the United States government had issued a presidential proclamation banning the recruitment of men for the armed forces of foreign countries. But this wasn't just a symbolic sop to America's powerful anti-war movement. Breaking the law could lead to the loss of US citizenship. Joseph Kennedy, the US ambassador to London and father of the future president, had loudly expressed his belief that Britain was finished. Some kind of accommodation with Hitler was not only unavoidable but advantageous to the United States. An even more prominent voice opposing intervention in the war in Europe was Charles Lindbergh. As a spokesman for the America First Committee, he divided his own country. His writings and speeches dripped with his intense hatred of President Roosevelt. They were laced with virulent anti-Semitism and stridently opposed any support for the British war effort. The Spitfire reigned above all others. Around 500 black Caribbean men joined the RAF as aircrew, with another 6,000 joining as ground support staff. In sharp contrast to the situation in the US military, there was no segregation in the RAF. The only Spitfire squadron with 3 Caribbean pilots was at 132, City of Bombay Squadron. James Hyde and Collins Joseph from Trinidad flew alongside Arthur Weeks of the Barbadian contingent. Weeks survived the war, but Joseph was hit by friendly fire in 1944 on the Belgian-German border, while Hyde's Spitfire 9 was shot down as he provided aerial cover for British paratroopers fighting to capture the Rhine River crossing at Arnhem in the Netherlands. Supporting a poorly planned attack by Canadian infantry and British commandos on the port of Dieppe, the Spitfires of 71, 121 and 133 squadrons flew sortie after sortie against Luftwaffe attacks. The intention was to briefly occupy the town, but fierce German fire had pinned the troops and tanks to the landing beaches. In the ensuing chaos, the Eagle squadrons claimed to have downed 2 Ju-88s, 5 FW-190s and a Dornier DO-217. 6 Eagle Spitfires were lost alongside 100 Allied aircraft. 50% of the infantry force was killed or captured by the Germans. Art Donahue had died weeks earlier. At dawn, he had flown his Spitfire VB alone to the Belgian coast, deliberately flying at the speed of a bomber to attract the attentions of a German fighter. The ruse worked, but the heavily armed Junkers Ju-88 held its own and the Spitfire crashed in the English Channel. Art's body was never recovered. The international reputation of the Spitfire became the symbol of British resistance. The Germans feared it above all their airborne enemies. It's possible to pinpoint a moment in the war when this transition began, the day when the Spitfire stopped being just another fighter and became a legend. It was a day that turned battle and ultimately a war. What in the future? As the sun rises on September 15th, 1940, operation rooms across southern England buzz into life. These are the nerve centres of fighter command. They receive reports of enemy aircraft approaching and guide Spitfire pilots to their targets. The past 3 weeks have been tough with relentless attacks on airfields, and the first mass bombing raids on London. The operation rooms are staffed by WAFs, elite members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, smart young women like Peggy Balfour. Peggy is exactly where she wants to be. On the day that war was declared, she gave up her job as a teacher. 3 weeks later, she enrolled at Farnborough. Peggy played a critical role in the defence of Britain. She's part of the Dowding system, the world's most advanced air raid early warning system. New radar stations stretch from the Orkney Isles to the Isle of Wight, known as Chain Home, detect formations of German bombers as soon as they take off from their bases in France. It wasn't a foolproof system. Low-flying aircraft go undetected, and the radar stations could only look out to sea. Once the bombers cross the coastline, their movements must be tracked by more primitive means. Volunteers of the Observer Corps armed with binoculars. Interpreting the radar signal is an art, not an exact science. Pilots were often given inaccurate information about the height and composition of enemy formations. Despite these drawbacks, the Dowding system, named after its energetic promoter and head of fighter command, Hugh Dowding, gave the RAF an enormous defensive advantage. Pilots were sent where they were needed instead of going on speculative patrols. Peggy's job. Peggy's particular job demanded intense concentration. At the height of a raid, there would be a stream of data coming through her Bakelite earphones. The information had to be interpreted and then plotted with a croupier stick used to push small wooden discs representing squadrons around the map. After training at a Staley Hall near Leighton Buzzard in Bedfordshire, issued with a smart new uniform, Peggy was posted to RAF Digby in Lincolnshire, rather far north, according to her diary, arriving on December 8, 1939, in time to enjoy Christmas. At a dance, she met Walter Lawson, known to his family as Jack, and Farmer Lawson to his squadron mates. Jack joined the RAF in 1929 at the bottom of the rank structure, starting as an aircraft apprentice, becoming a fitter in 1931, a trainee pilot in 1936, and finally a commissioned officer just before the Battle of Britain. Jack liked to dance, and that night he found the perfect partner, Peggy. It had been a long, tortuous, barely trodden path to the cockpit of a Spitfire for Jack Lawson. Despite the influx of new blood, the class divide was still rigidly maintained at the outbreak of war. Separate messes for officers, and each was assigned a backman, a personal servant to make their morning tea, keep their accommodation spick and span, and make their uniforms look tip-top. At Jack's 19th Squadron, there was even an unspoken agreement that officers and sergeant pilots drank in different pubs. Flight Sergeant George Unwin remembered that you never mixed at all, you were trained like that, the RAF built it into you. Peggy and Jack. As Peggy and Jack's relationship deepened, war flared up. The Battle of Britain began and Jack's squadron was moved south from Digby to better counter the German threat. Day after day, Jack flew his Spitfire, attacking bombers, set on destroying Britain's defences, ports, radar stations, aircraft factories and airfields. German raids were taking their toll. Spitfires were being destroyed on the ground and in the air. On September 5, 1940, Jack led Black Section on a 15,000 feet patrol over Hornchurch, but this this damage limitation, he spotted 40 or 50 Dornier bombers protected by 50 fighters. He threw his Spitfire into the bomber formation and with the 2-second burst of his 8 Browning machine guns sent the Dornier to the ground, but he was hit, so he headed unsteadily for home. Jack's time in the air had lasted about an hour, but death had been dealt out and narrowly avoided twice. There was good news waiting for him when he landed, promotion to flight commander, in charge of one of 19 squadrons, 2 flights, and much more appealing, 2 precious days to celebrate with Peggy. By September, Adolf Hitler was losing patience. The invasion of Britain was penciled in for September 20th and must be launched before unpredictable winter weather made crossing the English Channel too dangerous. The RAF was on its last legs. Hitler told his commanders that 5 more days of good flying weather would be enough to wipe out fighter command. British tactics against the Luftwaffe had been simple. When a formation of German bombers was spotted, 2 squadrons of 20 fighters would scramble to intercept, but this strategy was being challenged. We meet Douglas Bader. This damage limitation strategy was now being challenged by a theory known as the Big Wing. 5 squadrons, around 60 fighters, would take to the air. It didn't matter if they met the Germans before or after they dropped their bombs. This theory was promoted by the commander of 12 Group, Trafford Lee Mallory, who had a charismatic supporter, an influential squadron leader at RAF Duxford, a powerful personality who inspired love and hate in equal measure, Douglas Bader. Douglas Bader joined the RAF as a cadet, straight from his Oxford public school. Commissioned as an officer in 1930, he quickly became a star with the show-stealing performance at the 1931 Hendon Air Show. A few months later, he attempted a dangerous stunt, a slow roll in a Bristol Bulldog fighter, expressly banned below 1,000 feet. But Bader attempted it at just 30 feet. His wing hit the ground and Bader crashed spectacularly. The 20-year-old pilot had both legs amputated, but with a new set of prosthetic limbs, he was keen to get back into the cockpit. But the RAF refused to return him to a frontline role. With the outbreak of war, official resistance to Bader crumbled, and he was given command of a squadron at RAF Duxford, near Cambridge. It's dawn at September 15th, 1940. In England, 2 rival camps prepare to face hundreds of German fighters and bombers. At RAF Uxbridge, 11 Group is ready to use familiar tactics of fast and targeted response. To the north, 12 Group RAF Duxford is committed to the Big Wing approach, attacking German forces with overwhelming force. Those tactics are about to be tested, along with the courage of WAF plotter Peggy Balfour and Spitfire pilot Jack Lawson. Winston Churchill senses that Sunday the 15th is a big day. With his wife Clementine, Winston drives 25 miles from Chequers to Uxbridge. He arrives at 10:30 to be met by Keith Parr, who reminds the Prime Minister that he mustn't light his cigar in the bomb-proof operations room. After 15 minutes, the action begins. Radar reports 20 plus and 40 plus, even 80 plus, assembling over the coast of France. The 72 and 92 Squadron Spitfires from Biggin Hill are scrambled and sent to 25,000 feet, high above the German fighter cover. The first raiders reached the coast near Dungeness at 11 o'clock. Dornier 117 bombers with a large escort of ME-109s heading for 12 groups, big wing is ordered into the air, the first time with its full strength of 5 squadrons. Despite 250 British fighters in the sky, the Germans target Latchmere Junction, and importantly, connecting lines from northwest London to Clapham Junction and Waterloo. The rail viaducts and many homes in Battersea and Wandsworth are hit. Back in the air, the Duxford squadrons arrived. Jack Lawson is part of Douglas Bader's big wing, and his report said, "I was leading 19 squadron in the wing formation. We sighted 20 Dornier 17s escorted by Messerschmitt 109s. I went ahead of the bombers and turned to deliver a head-on attack. Firing a burst at 400 yards, I saw pieces falling off from the starboard wing, and he went down with glycol streaming from his starboard motor. I got a short burst on another Dornier 17 before my ammunition ran out, and I went home." This was just the start. By 2 o'clock, the second bigger wave, estimated 150 bombers and 350 fighters, is on its way to the docks. More than 250 British fighters are scrambled to meet them. Peggy lost the love of her life. September 15th was a victory for the RAF. It was a minor one, but it was a minor victory that soon proved to have enormous consequences. The RAF was quite clearly still in daytime control of the skies over England. As far as Hitler was concerned, that made an invasion impossible. On September 17th, Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. The next day, 200 British bombers attacked the German barges and army camps on the French coast. The invasion fleet was dispersed and German attention turned east to the Soviet Union. Jack Lawson and Peggy Balfour both survived the day, but a year later Jack's Spitfire was shot down by a Messerschmitt 109 over Rotterdam Harbour as the Royal Air Force took the battle into occupied Europe. Peggy lived until 2000, 60 years after the Battle of Britain. She never married and she never forgot the love of her life, Farmer Jack Lawson, or one particular heart-stopping moment when he revealed his true vulnerability. Jack had told her of his pleasure in the simple things of life, the joy of flying, and his one and only fear, that terrible moment when his Spitfire would be hit by tracer fire, when fuel would gush into the cockpit, when he would frantically push and pull the hood of his cockpit, trapped as the fuel burst into flames around him. Peggy couldn't move or speak. Then Jack turned and said, "Remember, whatever happens, it's always in God's hands." The spell was broken. The picture faded. She said, "Yes, I know that, and I will remember always, all the same. Take care." Standing there, Peggy knew no one else would ever take Jack's place. For her, it was forever. She would not let him know, not yet. They were all too busy. She didn't want him to think of anything but flying. Everything else must wait. The finest hour. September 15, 1940 was not the end of the Battle of Britain. It wasn't the end of the war. Bigger, darker stories waited to be told at Stalingrad, Dresden, Auschwitz and Dachau. When September 15 showed us that defeat was inevitable. The Luftwaffe, which had swept all before it since the invasion of Poland, could be turned back. Tyranny need not prevail. The cost of those symbolic Spitfires rose exponentially after September 15th. A stroll through the churchyards of Southampton reveals the price paid. There are 2 dates on so many gravestones, September 24th and 26th, the 2 deadly bomb attacks on the Supermarine factory. In Hollybrook Cemetery, their 16-year-old apprentice, Mervyn Hawkins. In the West End Old Old Cemetery lies 18-year-old aircraft electrician Ronald Barfoot, and in St Mary, so many names: 20-year-old draftsman Leonard Cox, shop boy Douglas Cruikshank, 14 years old, and Margaret Peggy Moo, clerical typist and a good friend of Joan Taggart and Cyril Russell. For the surviving workers of Supermarine to recover from the tragedy of those lost young lives took great reserves of fortitude. It was a mighty effort of will that saw them dust themselves down and push forward one of the war's most audacious escape plans. An enterprise like that needs inspiration and powerful motivation, and that is precisely what was provided by the tenacious dogfighters of September 15th. Victory was possible, and the Spitfire and its young pilots, designers and builders would lead the way. Afterward, it's probably absurd to search for the soul of a machine, even one pulsing with memories and meaning like the Spitfire. But as you look out over the soft green acres towards the English Channel, I can't help thinking about those ghosts that still fly with Squadron Leader Sugden. That's him on the photograph, his Spitfire cockpit. If they could stand with us now, those brave young people who built and flew the Spitfire, I like to think they would find a kind of contentment here, a sense of a job well done. The far photograph shows Jack Farmer Lawson, centre, with David Lloyd on the right.